Alrighty, welcome to our lucky number 13 SLiTHER. Today our host is going to be Meghan Porter from Indiana University, and we're going to be talking about, well, all kinds of things and what it's like to change a lab during a pandemic in particular, but some other aspects of that. So Meghan, take it away.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, as Chip said, a lot of things ended up happening in one semester. So really what happened with my course was I originally taught, I'll give you a little bit of an overview. I originally taught a 5 credit lab and lecture course combined. And for a variety of reasons, both financial for our students, GPA impact, and scheduling issues, I decided to petition the university to split those into a 3 credit lecture and a 2 credit lab. And I got that approved last November. And in my mind, I was like, this is great. I can really revamp these courses. I spent the last 5 years integrating them, and now I can separate them and have a little bit more fun. And then COVID hit. So then it was revamping 2 courses and putting them online, which wasn't quite as fun. But it worked out. So the way it's set up now, by the time they come to my lab, it's, for us, we title it Intermediate Inorganic Lab. By the time they get there, they've completed at least 1 semester of general chemistry lab and 1 semester of organic chemistry lab, just because we do a 1-2-1 sequence. So my class is about 100 students. We split them into lab sections of 20. It's primarily juniors and seniors, and even though it's required for chemistry majors, my class is about 70% non-chemistry majors, just because since we do the 1-2-1, my course can also count for the second semester general chemistry for med school and a lot of other pre-health. So I have a lot of biology, psychology, neuroscience, just non-chemistry. And they were kind of the ones I was thinking about when I was thinking how am I going to change this course. So a couple just to orient you to COVID specific adjustments. We were only allowed to have 7 students allowed in the lab at any given time, and my lab sections are 20. And so what I ended up having to do was for each of those 5 sections, split them into 3 cohorts, and they actually only attended lab once every 3 weeks, and the other 2 weeks they were doing some sort of virtual experiment. So it worked out fairly well. It did mean the organization was a little bit difficult because we had 3 experiments running simultaneously. We had the in-person and the 2 virtual. But it worked out. So when it came to thinking about revamping the course, the previous organization was what I would call pretty standard. I took it over from someone who had been done the same way for a while. 3 experiments included full lab reports. They had options aside from the first one. So the first one, everyone did the same experiment, submitted it stepwise, feedback, revisions, and then the other 2 they could pick from any of our other experiments, and remaining ones were submitted as worksheets. So when I had the chance to revise it, the first kind of thing that made me think about was student feedback. Since 70% of my students aren't chemists, the chemists I never had an issue with. They were the ones that are going to grad school, or at least something in the field. The non-chemists were the ones that are like, why should I have to take a chemistry lab? I'm not going to use this in med school. I'm never going to, take a UV viz of the drug I'm using, things like that. So that was kind of annoying in my mind. Like, chemistry is useful for everything. And then the worksheets are really what got me. For lab reports, we would use turnitin.com, but for worksheets, they would just pass them semester to semester. And as many times as I tried to switch up the lab, because our courses are so large and they're limited to 3 hours, we're not allowed to have students in the lab at all, even to just get data off a computer without a TA in there. So we really are limited to just the 3-hour section. And because so many different lab courses use the same labs, we also can't, stir something overnight. And so all of our experiments have to fit in that time period. So we're a little bit limited on that. And so splitting the course really provided me the opportunity to say, what did I want students to learn from it? Besides just the skills that they would pick up. And really it was the idea of how can I convince students it's worthwhile when, partly for mine, so I don't have to deal with the complaining part. So the way the new assessments worked, I broke them down into challenges and communications. So the challenges were actually just from the fact that even though they're juniors and seniors by the time they get to me, I have finally stopped fighting the fact that they can't use Excel. A lot of them have no idea how to graph, and make it look nice. A lot of them don't know how to use ChemDraw very well, even though they've gone through Orgo labs, so they're spending hours trying to draw structures. And then same thing for Spartan. We do a lot of Spartan calculations. And the last lab that they would use Spartan in was our general chemistry lab. And since a lot of people put this course off, it had been 3 years since they had used it. And so I was getting frustrated with how much time we were spending during office hours and in lab helping them learn how to use Excel again. So I created these challenges that were me walking through, here's a graph, and I would do it step by step. I filmed myself on the computer so they could follow along and pause as needed. And essentially they just needed to submit something that looked exactly like my final product, based on data. And so that was the challenges. The second part was what I was really excited about, to kind of help students understand that, fine, you might not take a UV Viz, okay, but you're going to have to communicate no matter where you are. So I was really trying to think of the fact that I had students going to grad school, med school, dental, optometry, all these different places. And so I tried to think of some communication options, and I'll go to my Canvas in just a few minutes and show you how I set it up there, that would really be useful regardless of what they were doing. And so one was an abstract. A lot of my pre-med students will do things with New England Journal of Medicine. So they've seen abstracts, but in our course sequence, they've never written one. They've written objectives. Like, I did this experiment to figure out percent yield. But they haven't actually written an abstract. And for a lot of them, that's really tough. Or for me, it's tough still to get a nice one. And then also the other three I chose were a research briefing. And I tried to give examples of outside of chemistry where you might see this. So my husband is an engineer, and he has to, he works for one of our bases in Indiana. So he relatively often actually has to give a briefing on his project to military officers who aren't engineers, but he still has to tell them why they should give them a lot of money to continue the project, right? And then also for the public, and COVID actually worked out in my favor right now, for the importance of science communication with the public. I also used the example of climate change and, a paper that was published looking at the number one indicator of someone's belief in climate change was political ideology and had nothing to do with science. And so kind of the importance of our being able to take those results and talk about them to somebody who might not have our same background. And then science talks. In our university, because our classes are large, my lab class is actually small at 100. Our organic lab has about 400 students, and our Gen Chem lab is about 600 to 700. So we're not doing talks just based on time. And so this was a great way to kind of, for my pre-meds, for example, since they make up the largest part of the course, I gave the example that if you were talking to a patient, talking to a colleague, and presenting at a medical conference, you might be talking about the same case in all of those situations, but you were going to do it in a very different way. And so the importance of being able to change that communication. So the two options that are referenced there is I wanted to give my students some options on how they actually submitted it. And so I'll show you those on Canvas. And then for the science talk, because it was actually building a PowerPoint presentation, they only completed that one once. All the others they completed twice, so they had feedback and had a chance to submit using a different experiment and data set. And then the last assignment that they're working on now is student choice. So they are going to do the analysis and then look at all those options and ask, what do I think is the most effective way to get across this information? And then they'll be able to choose that. Because I'm also doing specification grading that I'll touch on in a second, there are additional options for communication for people working towards a B or an A, which are an infographic, totally a Viper thing, and a research poster. Both of those are going to be done on a full journal article that they are working towards, so they're not necessarily getting any data for that, but presenting that data again in a different style. So with the specification grading, I'll just touch on it. It's the first time I tried it in the class. It was one of the things I've been kicking around for a while and figured might as well go for it if I'm changing everything else. So all the assessments, for the most part, are graded on a satisfactory or unsatisfactory scale. The journal article, because it's much more in-depth, is graded as does not meet, meets, or exceeds expectations. So just to kind of give you an idea on where the journal article, how that's coming across in COVID, is they only get to go into lab 4 times. That's the way it worked out, based on our capacity. And I didn't really want to plan 4 different labs because I knew I was going to have students out quarantining with COVID. People were going to be missing a lot, and I didn't want to have to put all of those online. So what I did instead was I designed a 3-part lab, and I left the 4th week as our something happens week that they could come in and finish their data. And they were all kind of working towards building up a spectroscopic suite of data on a lot of transition metal Fen and Biffy complexes. And so they were at the end, they'd have 6 different complexes and write a full journal article on them. So that was how that was working across the semester. Now, my students were initially pretty apprehensive about the idea of everything being graded on satisfactory or unsatisfactory. So we gave them tokens that kind of helped with that because, as I explained, I don't expect everything perfect throughout the semester. It's just not fair. So every student started with 2 tokens. They could use them to take a 72-hour extension on an assignment. If they received an unsatisfactory, they could revise it to get a satisfactory. And if they had remaining tokens, whatever grade bundle that they completed, they could earn the plus of that category. Because in our mind, if you had the tokens completed, then you were completing the assignments at a higher level throughout the semester. So they had 2 to start. They could earn an additional 2 by going out and finding a inorganic chemist who fell into any of the many minority groups that we have in inorganic chemistry and saying essentially what interested them, what the person's research was, and their pathway to where they were now to their current position, and posted it on Piazza for our class. So we kind of had a class message board to kind of also at the same time beginning the idea of what does an inorganic chemist look like out there. And so that was kind of fun. So they could earn up to 2 more tokens doing that. So they had a total of 4 that they could use throughout the semester. So I'm going to switch over to my Canvas and just show you a little bit about what that is looking like. All right, so here's my Canvas course. There's some nice quantum dots. So the way I have the modules set up, because we have 3 going on at all times, the cohorts have been broken down. So this is our final round. I'm super excited about. And so they will go in, they only see their cohort, which is really nice. So mine looks much more, confusing than theirs does. And the first thing I give them is an overview. So if I show you cohort 1's overview, it's kind of what they're doing. This is because it's the last, cohort, last round that they can calculate their grade based on the bundles. Some notes, and then they have their to-do list for the next 3 weeks. So the entire to-do list for the next 3 weeks for this entire round with all the due dates, links to all the experiments, links to all the assessments, everything's in one spot for them so they can just check it off as they go. So that has been a lifesaver during COVID so they can keep everything straight when everyone knows that there are 3 things going on at once. So that's been really nice. But what I want to show you, give you an example. So here's write your own abstract. So for all the communication, I really wanted to point out why it was worthwhile to do the communication, not just, hey, a journal article has an abstract, but why we use it, why it's important for an abstract, the fact that that's what a lot of us skim first to see if it's worthwhile to read the whole thing. Is it going to give me the information I want? And then for this particular one, I didn't give them an experiment for data. What I did was I picked some communications and I, blanked out all identifying information and asked them to write their own abstract on it. And then I always included resources for them, since for a lot of them, this was a new communication style. So these are screenshots, but there are videos included of me annotating all of these, kind of the type of information we see in an abstract, what don't we see in an abstract, that type of stuff. And then I always clearly defined what success would be. And they had an option to respond to their peers, and I'll touch on this when I tell you how it's gone this semester. But they've actually really enjoyed this. And they've been able to see each other's submissions, give feedback, suggestions, things like that. One of my favorites was the Lewis acid-base adduct. So one of the things I noticed with everything being satisfactory, unsatisfactory, of course, it wasn't ideal that it coincided with revamping the course, so I was creating new experiments and trying a new submission way. So that was fun. We have some changes for next semester, but in general, they would have their quote pre-lab lecture. So this was an example of a virtual one. They didn't actually go into lab to create the Lewis acid-base adducts. But I still gave them a procedure as if they were in lab, a short, I think this was the entire pre-lab lecture was 15 minutes. And then we have access to Jove scientific education videos, not just the Jove research videos. So I was able to pull in a lot of those. And then I would give them all the data, again, any extra resources. And then they would need to post a key insight and a question. And we were able to go back and respond to their questions. So that was how the pre-lab lecture worked, even though we weren't actually meeting. And then the procedure, so here's an example of the procedure, and I was really specific this semester in what to include. So this one was going to be done as a research briefing. So they had this checklist of the science. So the checklist wasn't as much about the communication style as it was what analysis do we expect you to have. And I felt like this was really important this semester because they weren't in the lab doing the experiment. So it's one thing for me to give them all the data, but they still lose a little bit. So they did have a very specific checklist. Then the follow-up on Canvas would be the actual communication. So after they had completed all of that and done their analysis, again, what's the purpose? So I gave some examples, I tried to go across multiple areas. So for my med students, results of phase 1, why it's worth moving to phase 2, research results have been accomplished in your 5-year multi-million-dollar grant, again, continuing to fund. And then the last one, as I said, I stole from my husband, a defense contract. And then this I really liked is why you will not be able to meet the initial agreed upon deadline, but it's still worth continuing. Right? Target audience, when is it appropriate? And then their task. So this is things, format. And here's one of the options I gave. So they had an option whether to write a written briefing as if I said, you were going to email this out to people above you. And so it was more in that style. Or they could do a presentation as if they were giving an update in a meeting. And so they could put together a talk and record themselves via Zoom. And I gave them templates. So I'll show you quickly. Here was the PowerPoint template. And it just has, key findings, introduction, body, kind of what we expect for those. And then the written one, I'll show you, this is the students that took their name off it. But this was the written one. So again, overall summary, key findings, intro, body. So they could have a choice, a lot of the same information, but in 2 different ways. And I was actually very surprised how many students chose to record themselves as opposed to type it out. That was not what I was expecting, but it was kind of fun. And again, how should I write it? And then the submission and response to peers. The other one I'll just take you through quickly was the science for the public. Like I said, this had, perfect timing with COVID. Why it's important. And I think we all know why it's important. And I got some great quotations here. And then they had an option again for this. They could either design a flyer. So we have a lot of people that stand outside our library and pass out flyers, or on a college campus, right? You're always getting flyers. So they could either design a flyer discussing the results of the experiment that they were looking at in that case, or they could be what I called a phone call to a friend. So they could record themselves pretending to have a phone conversation with their friend, telling them again about the results and what they meant, but they weren't allowed to do it. We limited them to a high school experience in chemistry, just because we looked at average education and average last time somebody would have seen chemistry. And so that was what they were limited to. And they got really creative with it. So here's just an example of one of them. They were looking at a qualitative determination of redox of vanadium based on the color change. And I mean, they had a choice. They could hand do it. So they could hand, make it look catchy by drawing and then take a PDF. She actually went through and did it on the computer, but they got really creative and just had a lot of fun with it. So that's kind of how it was set up on Canvas. And it did actually lend itself fairly well. One of the things I was nervous about was, the grading. Because with things being satisfactory, unsatisfactory, how do I know that people are actually kind of doing that the same way? And so it worked. This actually worked out well for COVID. don't get to say that often, but for a first time through, because since each cohort was turning in theirs and they turned it in over the process of 3 weeks. So only 20 students or 25 were turning in each assignment each week as opposed to the full, 100 in the course. And so I was able to assign one AI to each assessment instead of one AI to each lab. So one person graded all of the briefings. One person graded all of the talks. So we were able to keep it consistent. I won't be able to do that when you have, all 100 talks being turned in on the same week. So I'll have to figure that out. But seeing as we're still mostly online next semester, I have a while. So that worked out really well. Like I said, there was initial apprehension from students using the tokens too. I would get these emails like, I'm really, really sorry, but I need to use a token for this. And it took us a while to get them comfortable, really understanding that these tokens are for them. You had a bad week. You had to focus on something else. Use a token, right? It's not a bad thing. So you can see the change in the emails now. I get the email like, hey, I'm using a token. I'll turn it in Monday. And they're much more comfortable with it. So how is it going? I had some conversations with students about this. The student feedback, our Orgo lab, to give you a little bit of background, is known as like the worst lab on campus for workload. So that's where we're starting. So it's the same amount of work as organic lab, but they felt that it was more worthwhile. And these are students who aren't going on in chemistry I was having these conversations with. They feel like they're learning something useful. So a lot of them still say like, the chemistry, I don't feel like I'm going to do much with it, but I feel like I can talk about things more effectively. They definitely said it takes more work than a simple worksheet, but I actually have had students saying it's more fun. They really like being able to see each other's submissions. They like to be creative, and not limited to just one format. So they've really liked the different options for that. And they admitted that they would enjoy it more outside of COVID. I think one of the issues that we've seen with COVID is our students, at least, that were doing the labs, were apparently under the impression that our virtual labs were just going to be like, here's all the answers and just tell them back to us. I'm not really sure where that came from, but they were really shocked that we were like, no, we're going to give you all the data just as if you collected it and you're still doing the analysis. So I think that was more COVID than the communication, but their feedback on the communication they've said it's one of their most enjoyable labs, and that is not a feedback I've ever gotten, about inorganic labs, so I'm really excited. The few changes we're making for spring, are more for working through the expectations of each lab. So that was a little bit more about the spec grading part of it. Really making it clear what's expected to receive a satisfactory. So working through the rubrics a little bit more. I didn't show it, but every assignment has an individual rubric made for both the science and the communication style. And I felt like that was really important for students so that they knew what we were looking for before they tried it. And then adjust the aspects of the grade bundles. Also, again, on spec grading, I had never used grade bundles before, and my students actually do like it now because from the beginning of the semester, they were able to literally just check off things as they got satisfactories throughout the semester, and there's never been a question of what they're going to earn in the class. They know that, and so that's pretty nice. And then I do want to change labs to show examples of student submissions. I've had a lot of students tell me afterwards that, when I was watching somebody else's and providing feedback, I got some really cool ideas and I wish I had a chance to do it. So what I'd like to do, for most of them, these communication styles are new. And so I'd like to be able to show them examples from previous students, but switch the experiment, right? So they're having to do it with different data. But in general, they've really enjoyed the communication. And so I'm really excited about it. It was just a lot at once with the COVID semester, but that's pretty much what I've been doing this semester. And so far it's going pretty well.
Wow. Thanks, Megan. That was awesome. Let me hop in with a quick question or two for you. You mentioned how the students could earn extra tokens. What percentage of them did the extra little bit of work to get them?
So it was funny. You saw a number of students who did it in the first week. And it was those students who were like, I want the extra because I want the plus in that category, and they were on it. I think now out of about 100, probably 50% have used 2 tokens, so the 2 that they were given, and so they have now started to do the additional assignment, to have them kind of in the bank because we're not quite done yet. But I also have probably around a quarter of the students who have never used one, who have been getting the satisfactories. And I had a student email me yesterday when she submitted a revision, and she was just like, thanks, because this was a stress relief. I didn't have to worry that I got a poor grade on something, and there went my chances of getting a good grade in the class. Because as much as we hate, looking so much at their grade for a pre-med, it's unfortunately a really important part of their GPA. So it was nice that they didn't feel like one bad week ruined that option.
Okay. And how do you feel your grading load has?
So I have to admit, and I know people might be mad or jealous, I am very lucky in that our TAs grade for their lab sections. Granted, I say that before anyone gets too jealous. I have a 200-person lecture that I do all the grading for, so at least it balances out on that. But my AIs have liked the grading, or we call them AIs instead of TAs, but they have actually liked the satisfactory and unsatisfactory. Again, it was a learning curve for them, because they're used to like, okay, this is worth so many points, but at the same time, they enjoyed that they weren't sitting there stressing over, is this a 13 out of 15 or is this a 12 out of 15? And it was a little bit more cut and dry. So this semester I had to spend a little bit more time meeting with them and going through the rubric and kind of kicking around, well, what if they do poorly on this part of the rubric, but well on that? Does that equal a satisfactory? And so it took a little bit of time on that. And I think that's going to be us making the rubrics better as we go, but also my TAs getting more comfortable with that process. But they've said their grading is faster, which is nice because once we're back in person, they'll have a lot more each week to be grading.
So you've got a third of a section in at a time, 7 people, right?
Yeah.
How, I guess, vastly different is the way I'll ask it. How vastly different are the virtual lab components to what they're doing in lab? And I guess that's ultimately headed towards, so when things return to normal someday, hopefully, and you've got a full lab section and they're doing a new different lab every week, is this gonna ramp up to that with no problems, or?
I think it will, because the community, I think ultimately they'll end up with more submissions that they can choose their communication style, on, because as we get later, once they've done 1 or 2 each, they'll have more opportunities to do that. But the big thing is that the 3-part lab I designed, I'm actually going to put that in once we come back face to face anyway, because it lends itself really nicely to a journal article. I think sometimes just because of our sizes and the time limits on us, you're trying to get them to write a lab report on, 1 IR spectrum, which isn't actually useful. So I'm going to keep that one in there, as a 3-part, but I think the rest, I actually use most of the same experiments that we have run in person before, and I just went and got all the data for them for our virtual lab. So I tried to keep it as close to what we would then be able to transition back to in person as I possibly could. And so I think the only thing will be the challenges, but we usually don't have our labs meet the first week of the semester just because they need to get things ready and stuff like that. So I'm thinking that week will be good for those challenges. Then at the very beginning of the semester, we can say, okay, you're graphing, how to use Spartan, how to use ChemDraw, and then we can just set those expectations for the rest of the semester.
John, I certainly want to give you a chance. If you came up with anything you wanted to ask, please do. I think I muted you though, so I have to. There we go.
I got in late. I had another meeting, so I apologize.
No, we understand. It's
crazy. This is interesting. At Fairfield, I teach a class which is a lot small. My inorganic lab is small. I only have 2 in lab this semester. So everybody's coming every week. But, some of the ideas, I'll watch the video once it's posted, on YouTube for the first part, that I missed. I'm sure I'll get some ideas for this, for my inorganic lab in the future. And also I'm teaching an honors class next spring, so I'll get some ideas for that as well. That's a mix of majors and honors program class.
Nice.
Pretty good.
Yeah, I think there'll be some good information in there for you. At one point in there, Megan, you said that some of the student feedback was really positive. They liked watching other people's submissions and those sorts of things. Do you think that's a COVID artifact where they're just desperate to see any other human being?
I think it's kind of a mix. I think part of it is, and the way Canvas is set up for us, and I have it running through discussions for most of those submissions, discussions out on Canvas, so they can't see anyone else's until they've submitted their own. So I like that. They couldn't watch somebody else's before they were submitting their own on the same experiment. So that part I thought was pretty key. But talking to students, they also enjoy being able to see each other's styles. I've had students who are like, oh, I never thought of doing it that way. And at the same time, I think one of the things that I've always seen in lectures, they enjoy when another student, explains something differently than I do. And that's kind of the equivalent in this lab is they're seeing how somebody else is understanding the material. And so I think that's helping them down the road. I definitely think there is a part of it that's like, ooh, interacting with somebody. Cause they're not, this class currently, aside from the once every 3 weeks they go into lab, because everything is running at the same time with 3 different experiments, all the like lab lectures and submissions, that's all asynchronous except for that one single week and for each cohort. And so I do think there is that aspect of we're doing this together. But I've had students just say that it's nice to see how other people, and they also, I think it gives them some confidence, like, hey, they came up with the same thing that I came up with. Or, oh, we analyzed that the same way. And so I think that they've enjoyed that part, being able to reply. And I've also had students who have said that seeing other people's responses to theirs has been really valuable when they went to do their revision. If they didn't get a satisfactory the first time, they had the TA's feedback from that, but they also had people, the fellow students, who were like, hey, this was unclear to me. Or can you maybe focus on this aspect of the experiment a little bit? So they've said it's helped. It's almost like a second person feedback before you submit your revision.
Is there any one thing that stands out that you're like, gosh, present Meghan wishes past Meghan had thought about?
Probably, this isn't about the communication, it's about the spec grading. Probably reality of grade bundles. So mid-semester, I ended up changing it. I'll share my screen really quickly so you can see the bundle. Pull my Canvas up. So I have the grade bundles here. It's a whole thing on Canvas, but essentially this is what they were expected to do, and they could literally check
You're
it
not
off.
quite sharing the right window with us. There we go.
Okay. So they can literally just check it off, and this has been up from day one. But the original thing, this bolded part here was different, which was I expected everything in the bundle to eventually be satisfactory. And as I kept going, and also trying to equate it with like, okay, if they were actually getting scored, like an actual percentage, how does that match up? And so midway through, I ended up changing it to that in the A or B bundle, you could have an unsatisfactory at the end, and still complete that bundle. So I did make some changes there. The C one, I had spent a lot of time. I actually started with the C bundle to ask if somebody just like baseline passed this course, what would my expectations be? And then a little bit more for B and a little bit more for A. So I think I would rethink that, and kind of be a little bit more realistic in what are like what those expectations are. But then also to go with that, the rubrics, like that is something I wish I knew at the beginning, but I'm not actually sure I could change it because these were all new anyway. So it's definitely going to be a learning curve. But I think that's what I'm excited for future spring semester, Meghan, to have been through and know kind of how I can help the students a little bit better with that.
Now, does your B bundle say have different flavors of B in it, or is it?
It has options. So, if we did 4 virtual labs, you needed to complete 3. I don't care which 3. And complete can be satisfactories and an unsatisfactory. That would still count as 3 complete, or 3 complete and you just didn't do it. So, if you had, and that's what we've been trying to really get to them, like if you have a busy week, consider that in your time management, right? This isn't a course, I think at least my pre-med meds, they're trained like they've sent everything, it has to be 100%. And so getting used to a little bit of that autonomy, saying, okay, I control what I need to submit. They do have, on the full article, because there's the different levels, like does not meet, meets, and exceeds. Both the B and the A, you just need a meets expectations. But if you get an exceeds expectations, that can like make up for one of your other things in the bundle. And so they do have a little bit of option there. And then they have an option for like the infographic or a research poster in B, like whichever one they would like to do. I think one of the feedback the students gave me on, they're currently in the round where they can choose their submission style. And I had a lot that went into it. I was talking with them in office hours the other day, and they're like, yeah, I went in going, I'm going to do the flyer. It's one page. It's easy. It's really fast. But the lab that they were doing the analysis on was the ferrocene lab. So they had Spartan calculations and, MO arguments and then IR and NMR, more data driven. And so a lot of them were like, yeah, I started to not do the flyer because they realized it was actually going to take them more time to figure out how to say it in a non-scientific manner. And so a lot of them ended up doing the talk because they also realized it took less of their time to just put figures and key bullet points and be able to talk about them than type it out in that briefing style. So I think they've gotten a lot of kind of pros and cons of different ones, and it wasn't necessarily what they expected.
And you can differentiate like a B plus and a B.
So the way they're doing the pluses are based on the tokens. So the bundles are just A, B, and C, and D, but for us, the D is not passing. So A, B, and C really. And depending if you have if you have two tokens out of the 4 possible you could have gotten, if you have 2 left at the end, you get the plus category.
Okay.
Because it's the idea that you did the work first time at a higher level, and so you get that plus. And students have actually, that's the thing I thought they were going to fight, and really they haven't, because a lot of them are like, yeah, I can go do the extra assignment, I can get the 2 additional ones, and then I asked them, I had one that was kind of iffy about it because they had already used 2 tokens. And I was like, well, if we weren't allowing you to revise them, here's the checklist of what you should have had. Go look at it and tell me what grade you think you would have gotten. And they came back and they're like, yeah, I probably would have gotten like a B- on them or a C+. And I was like, okay. And then you wouldn't have been able to revise it. And so they were able to eventually like figure that out. But that's how we do the pluses.
Okay. Very good. I think let me change hats real quick and just say, boy, there's this website that I think some of this stuff appearing on as like a syllabus and all that would really be appreciated by the community. I think there'd be a lot of interest in it.
Yeah, I had to get permission for the briefing because I had found some great resources like online. It was a university over in Europe that had published like their career center had published one. And so I emailed her and I was like, hey, I've like adapted this. And do you mind if I post this? And I like gave, Viper's information, and she just emailed me back today saying I had permission. So after the semester's done, we'll start getting some of that stuff up.
That'd be awesome. I think people would really, really appreciate it.